Starting? It says it's starting.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. Very excited to speak with you about this topic. And I'll just get into the first question here. So, can you tell us about your journey through sports and your organizational psychology career that have brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's a great question. In terms of obviously the sport, well, maybe not obviously, but the sport piece came first in terms of how I ended up here. So I've been involved in the volleyball community as both a player and a coach since I was 10 years old. So my mother was actually the one who got me into it. She had played when she was younger, and when I was in grade school, she was a coach for the junior and senior team at my elementary school, and I would spend my days after school with her in the gym, and I was 7 or 8 years old. But then I joined my first team when I was about 10, and since then have been playing it, pretty extensively at all levels. So started playing competitively when I was 11 and then really never looked back in that sense. So played competitively my entire, youth life. And what really brought me into the organizational psychology piece of this discussion is, so I played for the varsity team at TMU, formerly Ryerson University. So I joined the varsity team. I was there for 4 years. And through that time, I was also completing my bachelor's degree in psychology. So when you're a varsity athlete, I'm not sure how much context you might have, but it ultimately is just a second job. So you've got your 40 hours a week or 20 hours a week of school. But on top of your schoolwork and your coursework, you have 40 hours a week of training and competition. So we would practice every single night for 2 hours. We would have weights for an hour. We would do video and strategy for an hour. And then every weekend we'd be traveling or competing. And so really that team becomes your family. And my coach was very focused on ensuring that he was curating a really efficient and effective team culture. So on the court and off the court, he was really focused on making sure that we had, core values as a team, and we had explicit ways of working together. That we were bonding and we had that right level of team connection and trust, ultimately to be able to get the results that we needed on the court. So we spent a lot of time on that. We spent a lot of working sessions on, defining our values and defining our team identity. And as I was navigating through my time in school, around my second year of university, I was trying to figure out, okay, what type of psychology did I really want to delve into? Because this was just a kind of a broad or general psychology degree. And as one does, I was navigating the different fields of psychology and really thinking about what stuck to me. And based on my experience in sport, what really fascinated me was the idea of a group of, 12, 15 different individuals with different personalities and different experiences and different aspirations and values, all coming together as a group in some sort of harmony or alignment, working towards a collective purpose. And achieving that goal together. And how are we going to navigate that dynamic? And how are those different factors going to work together to come up with the most optimal result? And I was really, really fascinated by that. And again, that came through from my volleyball experience. And so that was when initially I was thinking, okay, I'm going to go into sports psychology. But the way in which that, the field is and the opportunities that exist, I actually realized what I really wanted to do, which was working with different groups of people and teams to come up with the most effective way of working and achieve levels of high performance, actually was in the realm of industrial organizational psychology. So amongst my multiple grad school applications to different sports psychology programs, I had thrown in one IO psychology application to University of Waterloo. Didn't really think anything of it, but then after chatting with some of my professors and thesis supervisor, I ended up going to Waterloo and pursuing IO Psych and did my master's there. And since then, joined the consulting world right away. started coaching volleyball as my playing career was over. And since then, we're going to talk about this, but I've seen a lot of different synergies. So sport is really what got me into IO from a, long story short perspective.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that you have this like really positive model of coaching and leadership that inspires you to look into that more. My personal experience was the flip side was I was in just like a really poorly managed organization, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like there's got to be like a better process. People must have like figured this out.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see you kind of had the positive inspiration to pursue it.
Totally. Yeah, it was like what was inspiring was to really take what I had learned on the volleyball court and in a varsity setting and apply that to, I guess, the outside world.
Right. And it sounds like, I mean, sports is fascinating to me, and you touched on the overlap between teamwork and synergy and alignment on goals between sports and organizations. I think there's a ton of overlap. I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it can go well or it can go poorly, right? And so I think you also had the benefit of having somebody that was really conscientious about, what the impact they can have in that environment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess maybe we'll fast forward now to the work you're doing today at McPhee as a consultant. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you do, the types of problems you help organizations solve, and maybe some of the tools or methods that you typically use to approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the business model of McPhee, we focus on two different pillars of professional service. So one is on the side of strategy, planning, facilitation, a little bit of communication support. And the other side is on team culture, dynamic, leadership development, personal brand. So really focused on the people and culture side of organizations. So I spend primarily most of my time on the culture and leadership side of the business. I help to lead that practice within McPhee. Obviously, we overlap quite a bit with our strategy practice, and we all have experience within both realms, but my bread and butter is ultimately within the people and culture side of the business. And so what we currently do, what I currently do really differs on a day-to-day basis, working with upwards of, 8 or 9 different clients at once all the time on different engagements. But really what I'm brought in to assist organizations with, sometimes it's explicit leadership development and training. So, for example, the past couple of years, I've run a province-wide leadership and training development program for mental health professionals. And the entire program is based around providing clinicians and social workers and therapists, those who are champions and heroes for our mental health, with the tools to effectively manage and lead within their organization to ensure that the organization is running smoothly. And so sometimes we're building workshops that are based around finding your authentic leadership style, communicating effectively, tools to have difficult conversations, to give feedback. So really it's like almost like a management 101 piece, but of course, just taking into consideration the context that they're working within. So I'll do a lot of that work. It's called our High Performing Teams program. And the cool thing about that program is that it's about a 5-month or so program, with each workshop taking place once a month. And that timing is purposeful. So what I'll do with these clients is I'll have conversations about the biggest pain points that they're having within their organization and customize and build workshops that are centered around these areas of focus. And then between each workshop, in order to sustain the new things that they're learning, we leverage a habit builder platform so each participant within, at the end of each workshop, they make a commitment to a new habit that they're going to focus on building based around the information that we shared within the workshop. And throughout over the course of those 3 to 4 weeks between that workshop and the next one, the platform nudges them to check in on their new habit. This is just to ensure that, folks aren't going through these long training workshops, and then, which is great, and you tend to learn a lot, but then you go back to your regular life, your work life, and you forget like 75% of it. So the sustainability piece is really quite important. So I'll do a lot of that work. Sometimes it'll be half-day workshops. Some interesting work that we do as well is identifying aspirational culture and understanding what that looks like. So, for example, it's all about being purposeful in the working dynamics of that team or that organization and how they really want to interact with each other. Defining it and then understanding the tangible aspects of that aspirational culture. So what does this actually look like? What does it not look like? And how do we ensure that we are effectively implementing it? So that's, sort of in the realm of the culture and leadership piece. There's also some change management projects that I'll do as well. Primarily though, aside from the leadership and training work that we do, I do a lot of facilitated conversations. And that's actually, whenever I think to myself, like, what's my favorite thing that I do at McPhee, I always think, okay, yeah, it's definitely my leadership training and, the development work that we do, which I love, of course I love it. But I actually facilitate, a lot of key conversations with our clients that, what I realized is really I'm facilitating alignment of their individual mental models. So when they are trying to figure out, key priorities, they're trying to figure out, what their next steps are, what they're going to focus on, how they're going to work with each other, conversations about strategic decisions, facilitating that conversation and helping the group get to not a consensus, but an aligned decision, is actually some of the most satisfying work for me. And it really is just watching their minds work together in harmony, like in real life, right in front of me. So I find that to be super cool.
That's awesome. So how much of that follows a methodology that would be sort of repeatable versus being an objective third party that's sensitive to the dynamics in the room and sort of improvising in that context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have to think about that for a second. So there are various models and methods that we do use to sort of structure our conversations. There's like your classic like start, stop, continue model that I use quite often. Sometimes you are leveraging structures such as just understanding key strategic priorities and then identifying, okay, like what are your high level directions that they feed into, for example, or what are our key metrics that are going to be feeding into that piece too. And that's just like sort of your bread and butter strategy that can be repeated constantly. In terms of improvising, I mean, a lot of facilitation does have to just be with, be generally like being a very empathetic, observant, and clear communicator. So you do have to understand and navigate the dynamics of the room. One thing about me that I'm not afraid to do is really ask that direct question and facilitate conversations that need to be had, albeit they might be difficult. That's something that is really quite important from just like a team dynamic perspective. So, and one of my biggest pet peeves and something I learned also in sport is when you're leaving the elephant in the room and you're not allowing that conflict to be aired out, you're just contributing to basically the downfall of the team. Because what's that going to result in? Resentment, anxiety, side conversations, different cliques. You're not going to result in the collective team working together. And so facilitating those difficult conversations is something that is just sort of a standard practice when it comes to facilitation. I also like to use, if you're going to ask about models, I also like to use the 5 whys technique quite a bit. So that's a model out of total quality management practices. And it's really just about identifying root causes. And so like, it's basically just asking why. When someone makes a statement, asking why, 5 times per se, to really drill down into the root cause of their statement. Obviously, you're not blatantly asking why over and over again because
no, it sounds like my daughter.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be quite off-putting. But I leverage that, that practice, whether implicitly or explicitly, all the time. Because we're not going to, if we don't get to root cause, you're not being productive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this for like an hour, but I think a couple of things that jump out at me that are super interesting. One is that you are helping people identify with sort of mental models that can create challenges that are hard to understand when you don't have somebody observing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like there's an element of overcoming a bias towards we're not getting along because we're different, or you're one way, I'm another way, to we are approaching a problem from different angles and we don't quite understand why we're not syncing up. And I feel like, right, there's a perspective of, overcoming sort of preconditions, pre-understandings to, come together around these things.
100%. And this is so funny, Michael, because this is both of like our assessment backgrounds almost talking. Because like every time folks talk about just like diversity of thought, right? And like diversity of experiences and how that creates like the most optimal group dynamic. Yes, but you have to make sure that you're like navigating that appropriately, welcoming it, but then also naming it. Right. You're absolutely right in the sense that there's a bias that, okay, maybe we're just not getting along because we're different people. There's also a bias that many folks in organizations, I see this happen all the time, is that it's like an internal sort of like self bias where we think that everybody thinks the same way that we do. And it's not just like thinks in terms of we all have the same values, we all make the same assumptions. It's legitimately about like, how do we process information? And one of the things that actually changed my life was when I got my first job as a psychometric, assessment consultant at Caliper, which is now Talogy. But Caliper is a high-end psychometric assessment in the field, and that was my first job out of my master's, and I loved it because we were leveraging, like cold, hard, objective data to understand people within organizations, understand how they work, provide them with insight about who they are, and then also leverage it to create the most optimal team dynamic. And what changed my life was, before I had ever taken that assessment, I was in my master's, and I used to just think that I was like a really bad student. Right? Like it would take me forever to just like get through some of like the chunky papers that we would have to read for classes, and like just the overload of information, like it just used to exhaust me. And I couldn't, navigate through those little details like my classmates could. And it just like, I had no interest in it. It just exhausted me. And sometimes when I would share my ideas as well, so if I would share my thoughts, I would be met with a lot of confusion and my classmates asking me for clarification. I always just thought, like, am I just a bad communicator? What is it? And when I had gotten my first job at Caliper, I took the assessment, and what it did share with me was that I'm much more of an abstract, high level thinker, but I have like negative detail orientation. And it just like saved my life, because now I didn't think, okay, like I'm not like a poor student. I don't have like low mental ability. I just like think in a different way than my classmates did. And so understanding that has ultimately also really impacted me positively as a team member, because when I'm having conversations with some of my team members, I can, pay attention to the way in which that they share information, process information, the way in which we communicate, and almost pinpoint like, okay, we can communicate more in an abstract way, and I don't need to delve into the details, versus someone that is much more linear. And I have to force myself to communicate in that way, but then also acknowledge the way that they think. And so that's, again, a long-winded explanation into, yes, welcome diversity of thought, but also taking the time to really understand your team members and understand who they are and how they think. It can just make collaboration so much easier and smoother.
Yeah, absolutely. And with your explanation, I can see why our assessment backgrounds would play into a lot of that. And I think what I love about some of the ways that you're describing this, because you're already sort of, I'm thinking about a theme around sports and organizational psychology, and your sensitivity to airing out disagreement and conflict, but also, and this is something I see a lot, is the emphasis on sustainability, which I think to somebody who came up in the world of athletics is like an obvious thing, right? If you're not building skills that are going to help you be successful in practice,
Yeah.
kind of haven't really done anything. But at the same time, you know, doing a one-off workshop or doing something periodically, right? Like there sometimes is a little bit of a gap in terms of goals and perceptions. And I think
Yeah.
I'm already sensing like, there's a sports inclination around that as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's like an intentionality piece
Right.
around training and learning. And when you do learn something, it's like kind of like that 10,000 hours
Right.
theory, and that was drilled into my mind, like the concept of repetition. And you know, I had a coach, and I actually leverage this method still. When I teach one of my athletes something new, whether that be footwork or a technique, specifically footwork or a technique, like not really like a strategy, but more like a mechanical piece of feedback. My response is always like, okay, like you have to do that like 10,000 more times, right?
Right.
Because it's not going to stick. Specifically, again, the mechanical aspects, because as you've been growing as an athlete, you've, developed these habits that you're comfortable with. And they might be getting you the result that you want. So you're not really motivated to change it. But a coach's job is to identify, okay, well, from a technical perspective, you could be doing this in a different way and it would get you a greater result. And so there's that element of like motivating by results, sharing the why behind. I'm sorry, I'm just getting into a different component now, but like sharing the why behind the training and development that you're providing, so that folks can understand what you're doing, and how it's going to create like the optimal result. And I also find too that a lot of leaders don't know to share the why and don't know to share their thought process with their teams, and are frustrated when their team isn't doing it or implementing it or understanding it.
100%. And when you talk about the mechanics,
Yeah.
like we work with a lot of like at DDI with organizations. I mean, you could say our whole industry is in business because organizations promote successful technical performers into management roles who don't have the skill set. But from a mechanical point of view, the types of conversations that you are used to having and the way that you navigate through them, right? That like it is maybe a good example of, okay, there's a new skill or methodology that you can develop, right? But you have to practice it, right? You have to reinforce it. You have to make it your own. And so I feel like we've already touched on the next question, but how has your experience in sports helped shape your approach to some of these leadership challenges?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So, I was just going to say something. There's a couple pieces. So one aspect is, what you were just saying about like it's a new skill, it's a new conversation that you have to have. When we're under stress, we tend to revert back to like what feels most comfortable for us, what takes the least amount of energy. And so the repetition piece is something to help you do that from like an unconscious way of doing things.
Right.
Like unconsciously conscious or whatever that like little quadrant is that I can't seem to remember right now. But getting yourself to that point where when you're under stress, you can implement those decisions that you learn that are best practices. In terms of the way that sport has impacted the way that I lead. So firstly, there's a couple different ways. The first of which, and one thing that I really carried through as soon as I graduated from my master's and started working, and then also when I started to be a head coach for my first volleyball team. So I was like 23 and I was right out of school and thought I knew everything. And I was coaching a 17-year-old girls competitive volleyball team, and I was the head coach. And I was really, really hyper focused on empathetic leadership. I was very, very focused on it. And I still bring that and I bring that to my work today, but I was very focused on it because when I grew up playing sports, there was always this notion of you have to leave everything at the door. You have to leave your personal stuff at the door. You got to leave whatever happened at school, whatever happened with your friends, your parents, you leave it at the door. You cannot bring it into the gym. So ultimately, like, leave your baggage behind, right? Like, focus on practice. And that was again drilled into my brain when I was 12 years old. And then I didn't really realize how impossible that is till I was a little bit older. And I vowed to myself that I would never, ever, encourage my athletes to leave their personal lives at the door per se. And I encourage them to show up into training, being their whole person, bringing the experience that they had, honoring it, leaving space for it, showcasing that I cared about what was going on in their personal life. I wasn't just leveraging them or exploiting them as like pawns in my chess game to make sure that we won something. But I genuinely cared about them as people. And so that's something that I really bring into my leadership practice now, specifically because like the old leadership style of command and control doesn't, consider empathy. It considers it to be weak. You don't want to know about somebody's personal life. You're here for a job, you're here for work, and that's it. But it's actually just like a very faulty way of managing, because you're attempting to motivate and coach somebody without really taking into consideration their entire mental and emotional state, which is really quite important. So I encourage a lot of my clients to do that. It's a key component of one of the training workshops that I do teach, and I also leverage it in my current management practice as well. The other piece that I think is also interesting is purposeful and intentional collaboration. And so too often, I spend a lot of time talking with clients about how do we create a more collaborative environment and how do we feel more connected. And I often tell them the same thing that I do tell my athletes, which is when I stick 6 people onto a court, you have to be purposeful in the way in which you play together, in the sense that you can't read each other's minds. When things go awry, you can't just expect them to bounce back without you putting in some effort to bring it back into a positive state. So i.e., say you're losing a game, you're down a few points. A lot of athletes tend to avoid the difficult process of working through that challenge, and they just hope for the best and hope that we switch things up and hope that somebody makes a change and hope that somebody makes a really great play that turns the game around, instead of like intentionally working through that challenge together by acknowledging that, like, this is what's happening, let's do X, Y, and Z instead. Let's move forward, and we all make that commitment. And I often tell my clients the same thing, is that when you're collaborating with a team, you have to be intentional about your collaboration. You have to get to know your team members in a way that will help you collaborate better. You can't just assume, again, that everyone works the way you do. You can't avoid those, direct conversations that need to be had. You can't just expect that everyone's just going to flow just because you're on the same team. And you have to make an effort, right? So that intentional collaboration, I think, is really quite important, and we should be viewing professional teams in that way of sports. And then thirdly, this is my favorite thing to say, and something that I learned by proxy of my experience as a coach, is leadership is not about you, right? And winning something or being successful or being a successful team member is not about you as the individual. And when you join a team, you have to make a commitment to let go of that personal ego. And you have to make a commitment to let go of any sort of intense need for self-validation from the team, or any sort of intense need to feel special or put on a pedestal. So that's a big component of teamwork, is that you're part of a group of people and you're all working towards that collective goal. It's not just about making you specifically feel good, and everyone's being leveraged for different roles. So what I mean by that, and that probably sounds fuzzy, but basically, like, when you're on a sports team and if you're not the one on the court or the field, you can't be sulking on the bench, right? Because you're on a team, and the 6 people on the court are the ones who are, maybe actively contributing to our goal right now, but you also have a part in the team. And the second that you make the active contribution, like basically like your whole like zeitgeist for being on the team, then all of a sudden you're only thinking about yourself and you're being super selfish and you're not contributing to the team. As well as the fact that like when you're a leader, it's not just about like having power and being the star of the team. And it's not about your own sort of self-validation. A lot of leaders lead for the wrong reasons. A lot of leaders want to be the head honcho, the star of the show, because they want to be like that face of the success that the organization has. And that's not the purpose of why you lead. You lead because you're focusing on serving your team members. You're focusing on developing your team. And in any sort of interaction, you almost have to kind of put your personal agenda aside, and you always have to be doing what's best for the collective. And that's an extra responsibility that you take on as a leader. And I often find that too many leaders get too personal, and they get too emotional about their own needs and their own self. So anyway, I rambled on a little bit there. You'll probably want to cut that out, but that was all.
I mean, I don't think I will, but I think that especially like I think those are all the anecdotes that you shared around those really help frame it. And I think it's interesting to think about the types of things that drive many people to leadership positions, which are egocentric for many people, are the things that will now sort of have the possibility of shaping their leadership in like a very negative way, like you're talking about. So it's almost it's a good framing around the benefits of humility as a leader, right? And and what sounds like just a really common challenge that people need to work through in that area. So you touched on empathetic leadership, some of the challenges of command and control, the unsustainability of saying, hey, at work, you are this, sort of clean individual who has no baggage, who just does his or her job. And I think my perception is that the language of empathy is more prevalent than I think most people would ever, have experienced it. At the same time, maybe it's just my personal experience, but I've seen this sometimes there's a trade-off between high empathy leadership and accountability in leadership, and both are important. So I'm curious if you have any wisdom to share about the balance between empathetic and high accountability leadership.
Yes, this is a huge topic right now, especially amidst our previous 3 years where our mental health and personal lives were honestly positively illuminated as being having much more gravity and importance than they ever have before. And so, I feel like now more than ever, we're realizing, or organizations are realizing, and priorities are being made around people's personal lives over their work lives. And so some organizations struggle with the dichotomy between how do I be empathetic to my team member in terms of, what they're going through, versus also hold them accountable to the work that they have to do. And it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult to navigate that balance. My view is that before anything, before you ever get to that point, even when an individual joins your organization or your team, you have to build a foundation of trust. You have to manage expectations up front, and you have to let your team member know that you care about them, but you also really care about their long-term goals. So those three components are really quite important, and also to have a conversation about what that person's long-term goals are. And so from that, I found that to be pretty helpful in a sense where, if you have an individual who has these specific goals and you understand it, and you tailor, your leadership and your coaching towards helping them achieve that long-term goal, it's helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it's motivating to them. Two, it shows them that you truly are focusing on them as a person and as a performer or a professional, and they have more trust in you. and there's a deeper relationship there. So there's less of a chance that, that if that person tends to go through something that is drastic and super emotional, there's less of a chance that, and I think this is what many employers are scared of, there's less of a chance that person is just going to, be lazy and slack off and use this as an excuse. I think that's honestly like what so many employers are terrified of. They're terrified of, oh, like this person, like they're just putting it's sad, really. They're using their mental health as an excuse to not, perform in a certain way. Or what's the line that I have to tell them, like, hey, enough's enough, like you need to make sure that you get certain things done. And it's a tough one. So that foundation of trust really needs to be there. And that means that you have to trust them, in that if they're telling you that they can't perform in a certain way, we find a solution together to figure out how we can perform better and how we can be held accountable to our goals, or maybe we adjust our goals, right? And so it's all about that kind of collaborative process. And it's also difficult from an emotional perspective, because as a leader, you really have to put your skepticism and your fear of betrayal ultimately aside. And if you're going to make that choice to be a leader, you have to also make the choice that you're giving everybody on your team the benefit of the doubt. Always. Because if you're going to be a skeptical leader, you're not going to be a successful leader, and you're not going to have the trust of your team. So it is a tough one, but basically, to sum it up, I think it's building the foundation of trust, managing expectations ahead of time, understanding what your team members' long-term goals are, and always attaching your feedback and your coaching and the decisions that you make back to their long-term goals. And again, always giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. I think I definitely resonate to the concern that I think more traditional leadership mentalities would have around giving people too much leash and then being taken advantage of, which can happen, right? But your approach assumes not assumes a level of trust, but it positions trust as an underpinning to effective relationships, as opposed to trust something that needs to be earned, right? You have 3 personal days a year, right? You, as opposed to, hey, you're sick, take some time off. We can manage this, right? We were aligned on a deeper level. So yeah, I think that's a great answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask, in a general sense, if there's some trends, and we touched on a couple of trends in leadership, but some trends that overlap between sports and industry as far as leadership goes that you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So I've talked about the trust piece. I often see, it's interesting. There are some leaders who are big sports fans, and they often adopt the mentalities of or like lessons or values of like high performance sport coaches in their own sort of leadership capacity, which I always think is interesting, and I love that, because they want their team to like move as a unit and that sort of thing. So I think some trends are, again, like the level of I guess togetherness, or moving towards a collective goal has always been one that's pretty reflective of sport. And I think a lot of organizations, like, hopefully they've been moving towards sort of like that overall vision, but like really moving together as a unit, and working together almost as like this high performing team. And a lot of leaders like envision their professional teams to work that way as well. Like, what's our collective goal? So I find that trend to be interesting. One thing that I think is actually a problem sometimes is when we move too far in the realm of high performance sport, because there is a martyrdom associated with high performance sport. And what I mean by that, it's like, and you've probably, and people have seen it in like football movies. Like there's an iconic like Al Pacino speech in like Any Given Sunday that I love. That's all about like fighting and dying on the field for the person next to you, and fighting and dying to like get that, last inch towards like making that touchdown, right? Like it's this level of martyrdom, and it's this level that really glamorizes like blood, sweat, and tears, and dying for your team, dying for the sport, dying for your fans, etc. And so sometimes we go too far in that we equate like our like organizational job to the same scope, I guess, of high performance sport. And that's when we start to get a little bit unhealthy and we get too intense. And I've seen some leaders showcase that. And we have to remember that that's when the empathy piece really, really needs to come in the sense that we have to understand from a big picture standpoint, it's not healthy to be encouraging your team members to be like working late nights all the time and prioritizing their job over their life, and putting their mental and emotional well-being over their performance in the job. And so that's when I often caution some leaders to not go too far in the other direction when it comes to high performance sport. Like, again, this organization is not a martyrdom. And we can't get too caught up in that. Another piece, though, finally, that I don't really see it as a trend, but it's just been my own observation. Mm-hmm. There is a sales concept, like a sales theory in the Sandler selling system, which is like a really prominent selling model. And I loved this, and I carried this throughout, since I heard it, and then as I continue coaching, which is the theory of just like your own self-concept. And sales, I find sales and sport are very synonymous because there's like that competitiveness and that level of motivation. But there's this piece that Sandler talks about where you're only ever going to be as good as your self-concept. And so if you think that you're say like you're a 5, right? Like say I'm a 5, like I'm a 5 at selling, like out of 10. I'm a 5 out of 10 at selling. That's how I believe, that's what me personally, I believe that I'm only a 5 out of 10. That's my self-concept. And then say one day I perform a 10 out of 10. Like I have a 10 out of 10 performance. Subconsciously, the next day I might perform 0 out of 10 to bring me back to that 5. All right. That's just basically a fancy way of saying that like your own level of self-belief and your own level of self-confidence dictates your overall performance. And I love that so much because I see it happen. I see it happen in the girls that I coach. They're also 17-year-old girls, right? They're in a very like, formative age, and they're probably the most insecure they're ever going to be at this moment. So I see that happening where like one athlete, like on her trajectory towards improving and growing, if she has that level of insecurity, she's never going to surpass it until she changes those like internal beliefs. And I see that when in my workplace as well, when I'm managing some of my direct reports, right? If one of my direct reports comes towards me and they're sharing with me like sort of their own limiting self-beliefs, it's going to be really hard for me to push them past that limiting self-belief because they don't think they can get there. And they're also refusing to get there because it's out of their comfort zone. So that's something that's interesting from like a leadership perspective, especially from like high potentials. And when you're like working with folks on like succession planning, for example, or like you're promoting individuals from within, it's going to be really, really difficult to empower individuals who have a really low self-concept.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think somebody who's sensitive to that can probably pick it up fairly quickly in the language and the way that people are interacting around development. And like you said, it's hard to push past that because the second you do, people anchor back to their set point, rooted in their self-concept. Is there one thing, I mean, I'm sure it's a start to sort of identify that for somebody and say, hey, you may not realize that you are demonstrating a bit of a challenge to yourself that's rooted in your self-concept. But is there anything that you've done in a coaching capacity to help people reorient around that?
Yeah. I mean, from a coaching capacity, from like a volleyball, like from sport capacity, it's really quite difficult. I find that like objective evidence is one way to really empower and motivate individuals to just like help them change their own sort of self-beliefs. And I've done that in a leadership capacity as well. So, but they're two different pieces of evidence. So in a coaching capacity, one of the best ways to provide this level of motivation is like game film, right? Or I've like videotaped my girls at practice, like of them doing a skill, and then I'll show it back to them right after and say, look what you did here. Just make that quick change, like this, like footwork change, something like that. Try it again. Let's see the difference. And then say they make that change, we videotape it again, they watch it, they can't even recognize themselves, right? The more that we do that, and then in combination with like continuous encouragement and continuous motivation and positive feedback, and just like really showcasing that just like strong belief in them and their abilities, I've found that to be pretty successful. But then again, I'm limited by themselves, because they have to choose it if they want to improve, right? And they have to choose.
Yeah. Well, I get your point, because it's not just here's the evidence that in fact your self-concept is, handicapping your,
Yeah.
your ability. It's also, how do you interpret that evidence? Is that a deviation from my fiveness, right? And now really I am a five, but I'm just like, doing something that's getting me up to a seven.
Exactly.
Or, hey, I have somebody that really believes that's how I am, right? And whether I take that step of changing a mindset, ultimately, like you said, it is up to you, but there can be sort of like an activating influence that you can have as well.
100%. And that's why like the continuous motivation needs to be coupled with the evidence, because on its own, you can write off the evidence. And so it needs to be like almost like a team wide, push, like also from a leadership perspective, but you also have to develop a culture that supports that improvement, right?
Mhm,
So like if
mhm.
you have a culture of just like mediocrity, then sure, you can try to push your team to all the limits you want, but until you really focus on changing that culture of mediocrity, that's going to hold you back as well. And I've seen that happen in leadership capacities as well. And I mean, one of the ways that I used to really, really, have deep, deep conversations with sometimes C-suite executives, right, on who they were as a person, was when I was working in psychometric assessments, because I would give them their feedback on the results of their assessment, and we would have a really, rich discussion about what the results were. And sometimes they would try to, well, they would often, like, if they weren't a confident individual, or if they weren't super self-aware, they would often try to write them off as well. And showcase, the great thing about assessments is that it's like a holistic view of so many different traits working together. It's not just like one categorical view of someone. And one of the reasons why I love Caliper as well, because it doesn't categorize anybody. It's just percentile scores of certain traits. And so there's different ways of interpreting it. And so I've had a lot of conversations where it's like, hey, it's not that you're not good at this. And that's what changed my self-concept, right? About who I was. It's not that I'm not good at this. It's just that my strength lies elsewhere. And this is difficult for me because I'm not naturally attuned to doing that. And it's harder for me when I try. And for me, like that changed my view of myself, because I was, before I had that, when I was my master's, I was like, do I just suck? But no, I just thought differently. So, and I've had conversations like that too, where I've had, again, C-suite executives be like, I'm just like not bright. Like, I just like feel dumb. But you're a C-suite executive, and they're like, I'm just like a really hard worker. And it's like, well, no, actually, there's other factors that have contributed to their success, and owning that piece can really help you identify who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I love the sports influence of an appreciation of mindset,
Yeah.
its importance, its influence, something that there's so much language around that in sports. If
Mm-hmm.
you're just even not an athlete, but you're just around it, that you'll hear it all the time, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
importance of mindset and confidence, and just as a driving factor for performance. So it's a great inspiration. At the same time, I keep like as you mentioned, I keep thinking of like Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation with
Yes.
the Bobby Knight picture on the wall, right? So, um, but again, I think it's a great point about high performance and I've worked with owners and founders, especially in small teams of, you have passion, you're the founder, you're the owner, and then the frustration of why aren't people like me? Why aren't people contributing like me? Right. And just an understanding of the relationship, also sort of going back to what you were saying before about the martyrdom sometimes associated with sports and almost the um like the language around selling out, right? Which you don't hear in
Mm,
normal corporate environments, but you do hear in competitive environments like sports, music, arts,
mm.
right? But the idea that you're doing something strictly because of an intrinsic motivation to win, to be the best, to create something, right? That creates uh, challenges, I think, in those worlds for people. And I mean, you see burnout, you see people taken advantage of, you see, right? And a lot of it to me is rooted in that narrative of, you should be intrinsically motivated and you are demonized for acknowledging some kind of extrinsic force to this type of work.
Oh my God, absolutely. And I like the way you say that. And oftentimes, like, so that term, like selling out, yes, very, very common in corporate. I mean, sorry, not corporate. It's very, very common in sports, music, etc. Not too common in corporate. However, you see like versions of that.
Sure.
And I actually think it's interesting with like some of the generations coming in now too, like specifically millennials, but then also Gen Z's, like, there's no question on so like for a traditionalist might look at a millennial or a Gen Z and how much we switch jobs as selling out, right? Lack of commitment, lack
Lack
of
of commitment, lack of
dedication,
loyalty. Yeah.
lack of loyalty, right? And that's when, again, some of the most unhealthy cultures are when a leader deems their team to be like a family where there should be this unwavering loyalty
Right.
to the team without any reward and takes people leaving them as an insult. And that's actually interesting and something I never really thought of, Michael, until you just brought that up. But so for me, from a coaching perspective, so I finished my competitive career in 2016, my playing career in 2016 when I graduated from TMU. When I did my master's at Waterloo, I was the assistant coach for the varsity women's volleyball team at Waterloo. So I learned a lot and it was amazing. And then that was when I had my overconfident moment of, as soon as I graduated from my master's, I moved back home. And then now I want to be a head coach. And so I was head coaching a 17-year-old girls team for my old volleyball club. And I was rudely awakened because I put so much, and I was very, very focused on like empathy and like giving my everything and being such a servant leader to these girls. And one thing that was some of the toughest moments for me was that I was so intensely involved and intensely attached to the team. And I took things from an egotistical perspective in the sense that like I identified myself with this team and the results of this team. So therefore, when I had girls move teams, that was an insult to me. They're leaving me. Right. And I took that really hard. Right. But my lesson that I learned from that was that there's so many other factors that deem someone to leave an organization or a team. Sometimes it's not the manager, sometimes it's not the leader, sometimes it's not the coach. Sometimes you coach and mentor and manage your people so effectively that they have no room to grow anymore at your current place and have to go somewhere else. And that's actually a detriment of leadership sometimes. Sometimes you're a great leader and you lead your way out of a job, right? Or you lead your way out of your people leaving you. And that can be a huge, huge problem when leaders view people leaving them as a personal attack on them.
Right. And it also, I mean, again, like to that humility point, right? Viewing your people as your pawns or
Yeah.
your assets, right? That you have lost by, it's like build them up but not too much. Um, and I remember, was it Adam Grant or
Yeah.
something? Right, but he was bringing up like Lorne Michaels and SNL, right, and the expectation of, you will go on from this, you will have a successful career, and but there's a pipeline, right, to and the amount of careers sort of launched is a better indicator of leadership than individual sort of team performance, in some respects. But it's a bigger picture view, right? You're taking yourself a little bit out of the conversation by doing that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay, so two more questions. So both sports and industry have been challenged to create more opportunity and more inclusiveness for women and minorities. What have you seen in those areas that makes you optimistic, and where is there more room to grow?
Yeah, that's great. So the celebration and openness and willingness to accept different leadership styles is a huge indicator that, hopefully we're moving in a better direction with regards to inclusivity of women in leadership positions. So from a sport perspective, I'm seeing more and more female head coaches, more and more women on the benches of even, of male professional sports teams. You're seeing more of an effort to have women in the C-suite because it's the celebration of, again, that diversity. It serves as a, attraction piece because then you're going to attract more women into the workforce. Because for example, like if I'm looking at an organization and I see their entire leadership team are people that don't look like me, I'm not interested. Right? Like how are my perspectives and perceptions and life experiences going to be acknowledged if I don't have anyone who's been through them? So that celebration of different leadership styles has been really strong, like the emergence of servant leadership, the emergence of empathetic leadership, the celebration of political leadership, such as Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and her leadership style during COVID was highly, highly celebrated and really put her on the map with regards to leadership. I loved her forever, but the way that she handled the COVID pandemic in New Zealand was like soft, focused on service. It was intimate. It was person-centered. It was not, dictator-like or aggressive, which is typically what leaders have always been, the loudest person in the room. So there's a lot of like female trailblazers that have been really great. And so that acknowledgement gives me a lot of hope in a sense, as well as just acknowledging the different life perspectives and experiences that come from when you hire diversely. It doesn't have to just be women. There's going to be life experiences from, folks across the spectrum of gender and sexuality. There's going to be different experiences, especially across different ethnicities and races and ages as well. I think there's been, a desire for a more holistic perspectives, mostly because the people that are being led or the people that are, receivers or audiences of this type of leadership, they're demanding more, right? They're demanding less biased approaches. They're demanding less biased ways of thinking. So that does give me hope in a sense. Where there's more room to grow is despite how much effort and, what's the word I'm looking for? Progress that we do make, there's still always going to be individuals who uphold older systems. And that's hard because, it's not just, for example, if we're just talking about like a oppression of women perspective, there's still always going to be, for lack of a better term, old boys clubs. And there's still always going to be women and men who uphold those structures and, adhere to those sort of old patriarchal norms. So that's tough to navigate. There's lots of room to grow. specifically from like a sport perspective. So with volleyball, a couple years ago during COVID, I developed a female leadership program for girls ages 15 to 18. So female volleyball players. And it was a program that was designed to empower and encourage and motivate these girls to become coaches. And the reason why I developed it was because I heard a stat that in Ontario specifically, 75% of volleyball athletes are female. Only 25% of volleyball coaches are female. So even for example, the team that I coach now, I'm the first female coach that they've ever had, and they're 16. Right. And so that's a huge issue because you're missing the acknowledgement of so many experiences and perspectives without having that diversity in a leadership position. And so I thought that, okay, well, why are there not a lot of female coaches? And it's probably because the ones who are becoming coaches now have never seen themselves in a coaching capacity, in a sense. They've always had male coaches. They've never seen, a leadership style that could be exuded in a way that they could also show up as. And so what I thought was, okay, one of the best ways to do it is when their brain is still forming, let's get them starting to think about, rewire their brain, create these neurons, create these synapses that get them to start thinking like, hey, maybe I do see myself in this capacity and maybe I can learn how to do this. Because oftentimes like girls don't think about coaching until they're done their playing career. And by then their view of leadership is already solidified, and they either see themselves as a leader or they don't. Right. So that was my reasoning for that. But anyway, I think there's lots of room for improvement. I think that we can empower girls to start leading at a much younger age, because I think we're funneling our talent pool of leaders by not, encouraging girls to be leaders at a younger age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's well put. I think the spirit of a little bit of what you said gets back to something you said earlier about leadership not being about you, the individual, right? But what you can do through others and the impact you can have on other people. And I think the difference can be represented in a way as leaders look a certain way, leaders, right, are a certain gender, right, or are taller, right, or are like all of these different biases that contribute to what you think a leader ought to be, whereas a deeper understanding of the fact that good leadership doesn't have anything to do with what and who you are, right, but what you could do with for other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that concept maybe relates to this as well, sort of expanding a little bit. And I know, like, again, biases are hard to shift, but I think there's something there as well about an observation around great leadership not needing to look a certain way or fit into a certain box.
Exactly. And that's the inclusivity piece that I think is important. And I think we're moving in that direction. There's a really great theory of authentic leadership that has been around for maybe 15, 17 years or so. There's different variations of it. It's not very popular. I think other leadership styles and thought perspectives or schools of thought, are more prominent still. But that gives me a lot of hope, because authentic leadership is ultimately just based around leading in the way that feels most natural to you based off of who you are as a person and your experiences that you've had.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So one last question for you. As somebody who is a self-diagnosed individual who's willing to ask the tough questions and be direct, what is one piece of advice that you think leadership-focused organizational psychologists need to hear?
That's a great question. I had a thought.
Give it to us straight.
Yeah, that leadership. Leadership focused organizational psychologists needed to hear. I think I may have skipped the preparation for this one, so let me.
That's all right. No pressure. We can figure it out.
Me just think about it for a second. My mind My mind automatically goes to theory versus practice and making sure that there isn't an over-reliance on theory. That's what my mind automatically goes to. That's a big critique that I have for all industrial organizational psychologists. I feel like we do have an over-reliance on theory, and we have to be much more flexible when we go into industry because theory is not real life. And although it gives us credibility and it gives us an objective foundation to work off of, the biggest mistake that I see a lot of consultants make is being too focused on systematic research and theory that they're not flexible to the client's needs. And that's a big point of frustration, is because if you're going to be in a service role in the sense that you're providing professional service as a consultant, you need to be flexible to their needs. And I actually had like a PhD IO that I worked with at Caliper, who was part of like the headquarters, and he like worked more on like he was similar to you. He worked on like the research side of the assessment. And I was talking to him one time about a client who had requested like a job modeling or a job analysis engagement. And he basically told me, and he was really brilliant, he was like, there's basically 3 levels of rigor that you propose to a client based on how much money and how much time and how much respect they have for the science. And sometimes you cannot convince a CEO to spend the money and take the time to go through something that is perfectly analyzed and researched, and you have to just make do with what you've got. And so I think it's just about being a bit more flexible in terms of how much theory and how much science you incorporate into a practical application of something. So that's always been my critique if I in industry. So
Yeah, great advice. I feel like when I think about facilitated conversations, I mean, having the educational background that you do may help to some extent,
yeah,
but it sounds like it's probably a very small percentage of what contributes to the value you bring to that environment, right? And the idea that you could demonstrate something systematically, prove some kind of ROI, like you can drive tremendous value by having a focus and an orientation towards the challenges that people are facing and how you're going to help them without having a meta-analysis to tell you how to do it.
100%.
And so I think that's a good piece of advice.
Yeah, and I think one other piece too that's really important is it kind of is sort of in alignment with like the theory versus practice piece, is that I get most of my success and build the most amount of trust with my clients just by being willing to listen to them, accommodate them, and be super patient. Because the more that you try to push your own agenda and the more that you diagnose them too early with something, not to be medical, but the more that you diagnose them too early with something without listening to the full picture, the less successful you're going to be. And so I build most of my trust and most of my deepest partnerships were a result of just me listening to the challenges that a leader is experiencing and helping them talk through it. And that's what I actually do most often.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, my dog is finally here, so.
Okay, I am going to stop the recording.
Perfect.